Okay, the other thing I want to do is thank people who helped make tonight's event possible, starting with the Department of History and the Program in International Affairs. And I also want to recognize the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council, which also contributed and helped make this possible. And we also received some funding from the CU Athletics Department to help support some of our China programming. And that's kind of in relationship to the fact that the basketball team is going to be playing in Shanghai in next month, I think, opening the Pac-12 calendar. And so we've been trying to partner with the Department of Athletics in that regard as well. So they're helping to sponsor some of our events. So I want to thank them for that. Okay, what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce Jeff, and he's going to talk for a little bit about his work and his book and his experiences in Hong Kong. And I'm going to then follow that up with a very brief set of comments of my own, and perhaps some questions for Jeff, and then we'll open it up to the rest of you for questions and comments as well. So Jeff Wasserstone is Chancellor's Professor of History at the University of California, Irvine. Last time we had Jeff here was, I think, during the Occupy Central protests in Hong Kong. I think it was in 2014 when that was going on. So it's been a little while, but whenever there's a protest going on, we like to invite Jeff to come up to the mountains and talk to us about it. And that's partly because he's been interested in protest movements for a very long time. His first book was Student Protests in 20th Century China, The View from Shanghai, and that was followed by Popular Protest and Political Culture in Modern China. And those are just the first of many books that Jeff has authored, co-authored, co-edited, and been involved in addition to numerous articles, of course, as well. So he's a remarkably prolific scholar. I always kind of think, well, it's a new year, so there must be a new book coming out from Jeff pretty soon. And of course, we do have a new book that he'll be coming out with, as you'll be hearing from him shortly. But before the book that he's going to be talking about today, his most recent book is 8 Juxtapositions, China Through Imperfect Analogies from Mark Twain to Manchukuo, which, according to Craig Calhoun, quote, offers insight into China that many books 5 times its length. More insight into China than many books 5 times its length. It's fun as well as illuminating. And that speaks to a lot of the work that Jeff does. His work is not only remarkably prolific, but remarkably creative in the approaches that he takes to the studies of Chinese history. He's also served as former editor of he is the former editor, I should say, of the Journal of Asian Studies, where he really revamped and refreshed the format of the journal, I think, to the benefit of the field overall. But Jeff is not just a fine scholar. I think few people have done as much as he to bring the study of contemporary China out of the halls of academia and into the public realm. He's a regular contributor to Time Magazine, Newsweek, The Nation, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times. He co-founded the very influential blog China Beat, which I was also partially involved with. And he has a journalist's eye in many ways for investigating a story, and the skill to make that story readable and relevant as well. Finally, I'd like to say that one of the most remarkable things that I find about Jeff is that he does all this in such a relaxed way, with a smile on his face. And I've never seen him looking stressed or worried about anything. And I find that truly incredible. I suppose it's because there's already enough stress to go around, particularly with the topic that he studies and that he's going to be speaking to us about here today. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jeff Wasserstone.
Thanks. thanks. That was really a delightful introduction. So if I was feeling stressed before, I'm not now. No pressure, but I need to make some jokes, and I need to keep things light, even though it's a very dark subject. It's a very moving subject personally for me. I've been going to Hong Kong since 1987 was the first time I went there. And when I went there, it was as a break from a year doing research in Shanghai, back when Shanghai, and this is really hard to believe if you've been there recently, Shanghai was a really boring city to live in. There was no nightlife, there were about 5 restaurants, and going to Hong Kong was just relief. It was a place to sort of, I'd never been there before, but it felt like in a certain way returning to a world I knew of consumer choices, entertainment choices, and things like that, and things that really worked well in a way that at that point, not much in Shanghai I did. It was also, though, kind of a break from a place, Shanghai in '86, that felt very charged politically, as though people didn't know what was going to happen next, and they were passionately concerned about it. And young people had just taken part in the first protest in their generation, in first bottom-up sort of spontaneous protest of size in about a decade. And so when I went to Hong Kong, it was also going to someplace that felt much less political. And the campus felt much more focused on grades, and people were focused on shopping and what they were going to eat and do things like that. And now it's actually the reverse. When I go to Shanghai, I don't expect to see anything happen on campuses politically. There can't be, really. And when I go to Hong Kong, I know there will be a lot of ferment about people. And Shanghai has become more like Hong Kong when it comes to consumer choices and things like that, and entertainment choices. And going to Shanghai now, there's just too much to do. They pulled together in some ways, but they've reversed places in others politically. And that's one of the things of taking like this perspective on it. I've become very interested in Hong Kong increasingly. I didn't think of it as a place that was relevant to my research. It was just a place to sort of take a break from research. But the things that I went into Chinese studies to study, protest movements involving educated youth who then inspired people in other groups to join them on the streets, those kinds of things really haven't been happening on the mainland in the last 30 years, well, exactly 30 years, and they are happening in Hong Kong. So I'm increasingly drawn to writing about Hong Kong, a place that I didn't think I would write about. And I'm writing about it, though, because it's revisiting these other things. I love excuses to come back to Boulder, so I do hope there keep being protests, so they'll keep inviting me back. And it's wonderful to give a talk here. There are people in the audience who edited me, who I've edited, and people I've worked with on outreach to K through 12 educators through teaching about East Asia. And I love mountains, so thank you for having me here and welcoming me so well. This is a pre-book talk because this book, I have no responsibility for the cover. I didn't have anything to do with preventing it, so I can just talk about how wonderful I think it is without seeming egotistical. It's called Vigil, Hong Kong on the Brink. Vigil, the meaning of it is kind of doubled. The meaning is one of the key events that I talk about in it was the last time I was in Hong Kong was from June 3rd to June 7th. And I went there in part to take part in a vigil that's held every year to commemorate the martyrs of the June 4th massacre of 1989. You cannot commemorate their deaths anywhere on the mainland. Macau, which like Hong Kong is a special administrative region, has a small vigil every year, but Hong Kong's the one place that has a big one. And so I was there to take part in that. But vigil also can imply this sort of watching over something dying. And Hong Kong, some aspects of Hong Kong have been dying in recent years, and the protests are in a sense a fight against that dying. And to play on the term dying, another meaning of it, the cover shows white leaves being dyed red. The flag of Hong Kong shows a red background with a white flower on it, and the red background stands for Communist Party-led China. The white flower stands for a Hong Kong that's separate from that, though embedded within it. this was this idea of one country, two systems. After Hong Kong went from being a British colony to being part of the People's Republic of China, the deal that was struck was that for 50 years it would be able to preserve its distinctive way of life, a different economic system, and to some extent, a different legal system, a stronger rule of law. And so that white flower represented what would be different, while being on the red background represented that it would be part of this larger nation. And that was what was supposed to happen, and it has in some sense stopped happening that way. There's been a creeping of the redness into the flower, and that's what that design that the Columbia Global Reports, the publishing company that's bringing the book out, which publishes short books on urgent topics, is bringing out. It'll come out in February 11th. I have a few sort of postcards, but I don't have the actual book. And if you're interested in it, you can get it up there, but it'll be available through any kind of regular outlet. I was signed up to write it early this year. And what I thought the focus then would be the umbrella movement of 2014, these big protests, and then the steady erosion of some of Hong Kong's freedoms since then, and then a story of that kind of, there was no particular rush to writing it. I was going to write it over the course of a year. It's going to be a short book. Didn't seem too frantic. Tim would see me stressed out if he had seen me in the middle of the summer, because once the protest wave began, the publisher said, well, can you write it faster? Because there's more interest in Hong Kong than there will be at any other point. And instead of finishing it over the course of 2019, having it come out late in 2020, can you do it so we can get it out sooner? And I started writing, and I thought the movement would only take a few weeks, and then I would sort of write about the whole movement and the end of it. And then adding to the challenge was that the movement has kept going. And so I've ended up signing off on a book that's a book of history about an event that's still going on. It's partly about the past, so that works. This is just the last book I did. I also like covers that are striking, so I like any excuse to show this one. This is a primer about China that's answers to commonly asked questions. I did the first edition in 2010 on my own, and then brought in a co-author to help update it in 2013 because it seemed a lot had happened. Then after that, the umbrella movement happened. A lot of other things happened, so we updated it a third time with the co-author getting a credit on the cover this time, Mara Cunningham. And we thought, we've brought in the umbrella movement, we've brought in Xi Jinping's rise, and Xi Jinping really setting his mark on China. We can relax a little, and maybe we can go a while before we update it again. No such luck. The trade war, the revelations about the massive network of indoctrination camps across Xinjiang, and now the Hong Kong protests again. And maybe it's just that with China being so central in the world and changing so quickly itself, and its place in the world changing so quickly, we'll have to update it quickly, continually. At the beginning of the year, what I thought I would use as an arc in thinking about Hong Kong was in part, I didn't think necessarily, and I'll mention a few times things that surprised me, because I think one of the things that's important to realize is how bad people have been at predicting what will happen next in China and in Hong Kong. And when somebody says with confidence they know what's going to happen next, that's a good reason to be skeptical about them. China has a way of making fools of predictors through history, and that's certainly been true recently. But what I thought I would have, I didn't expect there to be protests in 2019. I didn't think it would be a big year of protests, but I did think there would be an interesting arc with 1919 was the first, the start of modern Chinese student movements. The first big one was the May 4th movement of 1919, and it was the 100th anniversary of that in 2019, so this was a time to reflect on protests in history, so I thought that might have an arc. There was a reason to be thinking about protest in 2019, and the last big protest in any part of the People's Republic of China that was anything like the May 4th movement, a student-led mass movement was the umbrella movement of 2014. And so in the lead up to this, I was thinking about 1919 and 2014, and also 1989. And so was a young man, still young man, but somebody who was a student leader when he was 15 in 2012, and then 17 in 2014, Joshua Wong. And he just tweeted early in the year pictures with 3 dates, 1919, 1989, 2014. And it was just a way of saying, there is this thing, the May 4th tradition of protest, where young people take to the streets saying the nation is our community is in a moment of crisis, we need to take bold action. The students of 1989 claim to be continuing that May 4th tradition in 1989, and then every year on the anniversary of 1989, people in Hong Kong gather, and he was saying, in a sense through this image, that in 2014, that was the last time that May 4th tradition had been present. Now, of course, there are people in Hong Kong now increasingly who are saying they don't want to be defined by China's past. They don't want to be seen necessarily even as Chinese. And I found out when I showed this slide during a conference on the May 4th movement that we held at Irvine, one of the Hong Kongers in the audience told me afterwards, Joshua Wong tweeted that because Twitter is largely for an international audience. On his Facebook page, which is largely for a Hong Kong audience, he didn't have that particular image. That this fits with the way, and he knew it would play well for somebody like me, who wanted to put this into that system. And you have a ebb and flow with Hong Kong protests of that, of things that are playing to an international audience and to a local audience. And you see this in a variety of things. The umbrella movement was first called the Occupy movement, which linked it up to Occupy Wall Street and other things. And then it became the umbrella movement, which had very specific local connotations. Because in Hong Kong, everybody carries an umbrella. It's always going to rain or about to rain. And then the protesters used the umbrella to block tear gas. So I'll give you just very broad brush the thesis of the book or the ideas of it. And so Hong Kong was promised this high degree of autonomy for 50 years. And a lot of people predicted that as soon as the Chinese Communist Party got its hands on Hong Kong in 1997, everything would change and Hong Kong would become just like other Chinese cities when it came to things like how the press operated, when you could protest. There were a lot of predictions of instant kind of doom and gloom, and people made predictions that were then foolish because in Hong Kong things continued in many ways the way they had been before. One of those people who made a wrong prediction was me, even though I try very hard not to make predictions. In 1996, just before the handover, I was at a showing of a film called The Gate of Heavenly Peace that's about the Tiananmen protests and the June 4th massacre. And the students afterwards were sort of asking me questions. I was a consultant for the film, and what they wanted to know was, after we become part of the People's Republic of China, is there a chance we would face tanks in the street if we protested? And I said, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. Nobody knows what's going to happen. And then I foolishly said that I thought I knew something that would happen. I said, I don't know what will happen once Hong Kong becomes part of the People's Republic of China. And I went on record as saying, but I know they won't be showing the Gate of Heavenly Peace, which is banned across the PRC. July 1st, Hong Kong became part of the PRC. Throughout the month of July, the film Gate of Heavenly Peace played in Hong Kong. And there continue to be things like editorial cartoons that mocked the leaders of China, which was something that you couldn't do everywhere on the mainland, but you could in Hong Kong. So one of the themes that I say in the book is that historians looking back at this whole late 20th century, early 21st century in Hong Kong, they'll say two things were surprising. One was how light a touch Beijing exerted over Hong Kong early after the handover, the first 10 years or so. But the other thing they'll say is how quickly after that, certain kinds of screws began to be tightening and certain kinds of differences began to erode. Initially, even, there were some things in which Hong Kong ways seemed to be spreading over to the mainland, as much as mainland ways were spreading into Hong Kong. And it seemed that there was a possibility. The media became a little bit freer in South China, just over the border from Hong Kong. The style of consumer life, entertainment life became more like Hong Kong on the mainland than it had been. So there's more of a give and take. But in the last few years, it's been a tightening and an effort to, in a sense, die Hong Kong red. There are two metaphors for these, both involving animals, that can be useful in thinking about this. One idea of why Hong Kong would be left alone was because Beijing needed the wealth that was created by Hong Kong and needed Hong Kong as a kind of go-between point for business. So the animal here is the golden goose, the goose that lays the golden eggs in the fable. The goose, Hong Kong was the goose that laid the golden eggs. It would bring wealth to a China that was not yet wealthy. And Beijing would have to keep it in good shape, would have to keep convincing foreign companies that they want to do business in Hong Kong, that it was a place where things operated differently, so the golden goose would have to be kept alive. Chris Patton, the last governor the last colonial governor of Hong Kong, said that's a good idea to think about the golden goose, but history is littered with the carcasses of decapitated geese. It doesn't always work that way. But it did, to a certain extent, work that way for 10 years. The other thing, though, in more recent time, the tightening, a different animal metaphor, which a Hong Kong writer named Canny Leung, who's been translated recently on this wonderful website called China Heritage, that's run by Jeremy Barmay. She says what you should think about with Hong Kong more recently is the story of the frog in a pot that's being brought to a boil. If the temperature goes up slowly, the frog is lulled into a sense of nothing really changing. And then if it's gone up enough, then the frog dies. But some people have been feeling lately in Hong Kong that the cook is turning the flame up quickly enough that they're really noticing. And the protests are, in a sense, an effort to respond to that. And I think that's a fairly powerful way to think about it. So when I give talks, often there'll be variations of a talk I'll give different places, and they'll show up on video or whatever, and people can watch that. I always want to do something to say, even if some of these things are familiar from other talks, there's something unique to the talk that I'm giving now and that I'm giving here. So I'd like to integrate something that was just in the news. And fortunately for me, the NBA came in and helped out with Hong Kong in the news, which actually may make the University of Colorado's basketball team of great interest when they play in China. If people aren't allowed to watch NBA games, then college games are the best game in town. So this is a talk being given in the wake of the NBA title. Now, I did give this talk, a version of it, in Colorado Springs yesterday. So I don't want you to think you're just getting yesterday's news. Today, there was news, and these are dated October 23, about the first games of the NBA. And like with so many stories about China and about Hong Kong, there are two ways to read it. One is that CCTV, the television station that usually plays the opening games of the NBA season, did not show them because they were angry at an NBA manager expressing support for Hong Kong, and then the head of the NBA not punishing him, and there's been back and forth. I won't repeat all of it, but so CCTV didn't show the games. But Tencent, which is a more private company that is more profit-driven, streamed them, and they had massive viewership. So there was either a boycott and a blocking or not quite. So the other thing that's happened now with the NBA, and just today, Shaquille O'Neal, after LeBron James said that no, we shouldn't talk about issues like Hong Kong, Shaquille O'Neal, another very famous basketball player, said, no, we should be able to talk about whatever we want, we should not. So now there's always a chance that Shaquille O'Neal will get in trouble with Hong Kong. His films and things, like the classic Kazam, which I'm sure all of you have seen. But he may get in trouble. But this is just the latest time when the Hong Kong story has become entwined in all aspects of the international world, in part because China itself is so entwined, and Hong Kong has always been entwined. The story is not just something happening in one confined place. Even though the protests are just happening in Hong Kong, they haven't spread over the border into the mainland, which is actually what Beijing would be most concerned about. But it's affecting almost every realm of sports and entertainment. There's a new movie version, a live-action version of Mulan that's coming out from Disney. The actress expressed support for the police in Hong Kong, so there are calls for boycotting her from people who are supporting the protests. Disneyland in Hong Kong is now the emptiest Disneyland on earth because it's hard to get to with the protest. So it's affecting all kinds of different things. It's affecting all aspects, even though it's Hong Kong, it's affecting all aspects of American life, including This American Life, a radio program that's devoted to stories about life in America, and did a rare program that was all about life in Hong Kong during the protests, trying to get this out. And it's not just that things are going out from Hong Kong to other parts of the world, but other parts of the world, including youth culture globally, are affecting the protests in Hong Kong. Hong Kong's always been a very cosmopolitan city, and the protests are drawing on symbols, tactics from around the world, and also influencing symbols and tactics in other places, but they're also drawing on mass media and entertainment. The generation of particularly intense activists who were born about the time of the handover, one of them was interviewed on This American Life and talked about how growing up with the Harry Potter books and a kind of idea of this last-ditch effort of good against evil, and that they thought of themselves as being youth of a cursed generation, like the cursed child, or they thought of themselves as fighting back, like the youth in Harry Potter. But another globally important across the mainland as well as in Hong Kong that's been very important in the protests in 2014 and now again in a different way is the Hunger Games. The Hunger Games series. In 2014, around the time Mockingjay came out with this symbol of revolt, there were some students in 2014 that used that symbol. And again, the Hunger Games is a story about young people who are trying to overthrow or fight back against impossible odds. This is David and Goliath's story. There are versions of these kinds of things for every generation, but that's an important one. And then during the current protests, as they've moved more toward violence, there have been people who have struck poses that are reminiscent of Katniss Everdeen in the Hunger Games, and this kind of story of and the slogan that some are saying is, if we burn, you burn with us, which is a slogan that's said in the film as things are really heating up with the youth against impossible odds. And spoiler alert, like with David and Goliath, the seemingly incredibly overmatched protagonists in the Hunger Games actually do win in the end. So you can think of it as both, it's saying we're living in a dystopia that's being brought down, and it offers a kind of hope, although often many people aren't thinking that there will be any possibility, at least for short term, of that kind of success. And it's not something that I see an easy way to have an ending like that. So, I said about what's happening now, but I also want to say this is the talk you're hearing here. So another part about the NBA story that came up, and I'll get to why this is about Boulder in a minute. The NBA story, there's Joe Tsai, who has a connection to Alibaba, and South China Morning Post, which owns Alibaba, so Hong Kong. He came out with a statement about why, to understand the situation in Hong Kong, and why it was particularly bad if people in a foreign country were coming in on the side of the Hong Kong protesters, because what he said what they were forgetting was what a horrible legacy of colonialism and imperialist humiliation the Chinese people had lived through. And it is important to never forget that Hong Kong was not a free democratic city before it became part of the People's Republic of China. It was a colonial city that was part of the British Empire, that had gone to the British Empire at the end of the Opium War as a kind of victor's prize. And Joe Tsai also he said, you've got to remember all the things that happened in China's past. And he brought up including the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, that was then followed by an invasion of China by the 8 Allied armies. So keep that in mind, he was saying, when you're looking at what's happening in Hong Kong. Think about what a legacy there is for many people in China to remember how the outside world has interfered with China and infringed on Chinese sovereignty. And one of the things Beijing is saying about the protests in Hong Kong is that they're receiving backing from foreign forces, and there are some protesters who've waved American flags and have waved British flags. and that plays into that narrative. I would say that actually my own feeling of the narrative is that many people see this Hong Kong's tragedy as it went from being one kind of colonial setting that was not able to control its own fate, to becoming in some ways a colony of another distant capital. And it went from having a governor appointed by London to having a chief executive that's basically appointed by Beijing. There's an election, but only about under 2,000 locals get to vote in it, and the only people who can be the chief executive are ones that are okayed by Beijing. That's a different kind of narrative, but this narrative was about, think of China as a place that experienced these things like the Boxer Rebellion. Okay, what does the Boxer Rebellion have to do with Boulder? Well, one of the last times I was here, I gave a talk on it. And I was supposed to be finishing a book on the Boxer Uprising of 1900 and the different ways it's understood. And the very fact that in the West it's remembered as the Boxer Rebellion, in China it's often remembered as the invasion of the 8 Allied armies. And we have selective memory on both sides. There's selective memory by people, sometimes in China, who selectively forget that the Boxers were quite terrorists who killed innocent Christians, largely Chinese Christians. And in the West, we often have selective forgetting of the fact that we invaded China and took a lot of retribution, and the invading army afterwards killed many more Chinese people who were also innocent than the Boxers ever had. Before I came up with that tie to Boulder, which is a little weak, I admit, I had a tie to Colorado via the fact that Colorado Springs is the Olympic city. And to talk about the Hong Kong story in the last 10 years, or 11 years, it's helpful to keep the Olympics in mind for a couple of reasons. The Olympics was a time in 2008 when China was rising, and China was very concerned about how the world at large viewed what was going on there. They did not want to boycott the Olympics on human rights issues. They were making promises to keep liberalizing in a direction that had been liberalizing before. And there were some calls for boycotts, but they didn't really get enough traction to have a big effect. And there was a way in which the one country, two systems worked, because some events were held in Hong Kong. The equestrian events, Hong Kong has a long tradition through race courses and other things of horses. And this was the last moment when, at least in some way, even though there were already protests in Hong Kong before then, when it was felt that things were tightening, in 2008 there were a lot of people in Hong Kong who now would be on the side of the protesters, who now would be on the side of saying, don't think of me as Chinese, who in 2008 were very happy about the Olympics coming to Hong Kong, coming to Beijing, and having a peace in Hong Kong. So that was kind of the last moment when this kind of thing worked. The Olympics are also important, though, because there's going to be another Olympics in 2022 in China, the Winter Olympics. And there started to be some rumblings about calls for a boycotting of that by people concerned about the mistreatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And I think there's a concern that if Hong Kong went in a certain direction, there would be possibly calls for more of a boycott. So one thing that's made, there are other reasons as well, but one reason why the authorities, even though there's been a lot of police brutality against protesters, and there's been a ratcheting up of violence from police, and then violence by protesters, to more violence by police, and also mobs have attacked protesters to try to crush them. There haven't been large-scale shootings. The shootings have largely been beanbag bullets and then rubber bullets. Only very small number of live ammunition was fired the first time on October 1st. There have been some deaths by suicide that could be linked to this, but there haven't been the sort of large number of martyrs that people worried about. There haven't been explicit use of the People's Liberation Army. There are a variety of reasons for this, but one is actually that this is a part of work. This would do something to world opinion that could interfere with some of the plans that Beijing has, that Xi Jinping has, including hosting the Olympics. On the other hand, one of the things that's changed in the last 5-10 years or so is China's in a position of strength internationally that it's less concerned about having to appease and stay in the good graces of the international world. Margaret Thatcher, who worked out the deal with Deng Xiaoping in 1984 for Hong Kong's transition, said after 1989, when some people said, do you still think that was an acceptable thing to do given the turn that happened with the massacre? She said she thought it was still going to work because China would want to be seen in the forum of the world as keeping true to its promises about Hong Kong. And that was at a time when Hong Kong was seen as testing China's ability to be a major player in the world. Now China is a major player in the world. There are many companies and countries that have seen many things happen that in an earlier period would have sparked outrage and hasn't as much. All right, now that I've told you what this has to do with today and Colorado, I'm going to switch back to some history and show you some images. Try to walk through this quickly. This is the umbrella movement in 2014, which I went over to witness part of, and it was an amazing moment when the streets were taken over, the central part of a major city and some other parts too, for 79 days, and it had a kind of festive atmosphere and also an intense atmosphere. It was an effort to try to get the changes in the way the chief executive was selected so that there would be genuine elections rather than a kind of selection by a small number of people. And like a lot of movements, including the current movement, including movements in many other parts of the world, including past movements in the United States, the umbrella movement became over time a struggle in part to defend the right to protest itself. In 2019, that's become again, it's become a pushback against police actions. In 2014, the umbrella movement grew dramatically when tear gas was used against protesters, something that hadn't been done against Hong Kong protesters in Hong Kong. There was one international event that had a tear gas, but it had a kind of shock value. Students in 2014 and others put up something called a Lenin Wall. The Lenin Wall was for John Lennon, not Vladimir Lenin. And it goes back to something that was set up in Prague in the early 1980s when people there thought they admired John Lennon's song Imagine, about a utopian kind of world. They painted a wall, made things honoring John Lennon. In Hong Kong, as with so many things, something was borrowed from another part of the world, and this is true in other protests too, and given a distinctively local spin. In this case, by making, instead of paint, using Post-it notes and individuals writing out, doing art and doing slogans in that. I'm going to throw out one more kind of broad way of thinking about Hong Kong, and Tim mentioned my last book was 8 Juxtapositions. I like to juxtapose things that aren't commonly juxtaposed as a way to kind of shock you into thinking of something in a new way. And the way I've thought about Hong Kong, which is often compared to other Chinese cities, or to other Asian cities, or to other colonial cities, but I thought of Hong Kong during the Cold War as being a lot like West Berlin. West Berlin was perched beside a big communist country. It was surrounded by East Germany. It was an outpost where capitalism and consumerism that couldn't exist just over the border existed, where different kinds of freedom of speech and the press were there. And Hong Kong was perched at the edge of of communist China. John le Carré, who wrote the most famous spy novels about Berlin, set in West Berlin, had people in West Berlin listening in on East Berlin. He set one book in Asia early on. It was The Honorable Schoolboy. Began in Hong Kong with people listening in on the Chinese mainland. Then in 1989, West Berlin and East Berlin became one. The waves of West Berlin really spread over East Berlin. Now you can't even tell when you move between the two parts of the city, as I did earlier this year, when you've entered the former East or the former West. There's a dream that a plan called the Greater Bay Area Plan that's being promoted by Hong Kong's government and the governments over the border, that a time will come when the same seamlessness will mean you can move from Hong Kong to Shenzhen and back and forth through the Greater Bay Area, and you won't be always that aware of moving across the border. And this is seen as a dreamlike thing, the best of both worlds to some and a nightmare to others. Since 1997, the question though is, when Hong Kong became integrated with the rest of the Pearl Delta, did the ways of Hong Kong spread across the border, or did the ways of across the border spread into Hong Kong? And in many ways, politically, I think the story has been spreading in, even while some other ways it's spread out. So this looks like the Berlin Wall, is the most famous icon of East and West Berlin. On the west side of the wall, there was also all this painting. People would go up to it and express themselves. This looks like the west side of the wall. After the suppression of the umbrella movement and the sort of depoliticization of the city, I came back and looked at that same wall, and it looked like the east side of the Berlin Wall, which was guarded and had nothing there for expression. When I've gone back to Hong Kong since the umbrella movement, and people did this even since 1997, what you would always do would be you would look for signs that something had disappeared from Hong Kong, that something that you used to be able to assume would mark a difference from Hong Kong had disappeared, but you would also look for things that reminded you that you were not in any other part of the People's Republic of China. And you would always find both. And still after the umbrella movement, you would see things that, like, books could still be published in Hong Kong and sold that can't be published on the mainland, but it becomes harder to find them. There are protests held in Hong Kong that can't be held on the other. And there could be images associated with the 1989 protests, so this Goddess of Democracy statue that you can't find on the mainland, but you can in Hong Kong. So you see things that can happen and can't happen, and you kind of weigh it, and the idea of whether how close to boiling is the pot getting is one of the ways to think about it. But there hasn't been a time in the last 5 years when it seems the temperature has gone down. And on the mainland, there hasn't been a time in the last 10 years when from year to year, going to the mainland has felt that it was liberalizing or freer than it had been the last time. And that's led to a sense of crisis that's part of the crisis here. And this was brought to a head to me in part in November of last year, when I went to Hong Kong and there was going to be a showing of a political cartoonist's work that was challenging Xi Jinping. And this was the kind of thing that could only happen in Hong Kong, a showing of these cartoons. Joshua Wong, one of the heroes of 2014, was going to speak. 2 members of Pussy Riot, the Russian activist group, were in town for an LGBT event. They were going to speak. It was going to be part of Free Speech Week. The show was canceled at the last minute, in part because threats were made against the cartoonist's family, the cartoonist is out of China, but his family has family members back in China. So that was a kind of, the fact that the exhibit was going to be held was, look how different Hong Kong is. The fact that it was canceled, look how Hong Kong's becoming more like the mainland. Then Joshua Wong decided, and the 2 members of Pussy Riot, they would hold a pop-up protest, and they advertised by social media, come gather with us and show us that the fight hasn't gone out of us. That was like, oh, well, this is still something that's different in Hong Kong. But almost nobody showed up. So I went to this event where Joshua Wong is in the balaclava, whatever. The members of Pussy Riot always wear that, and he wore it to show solidarity. They held up posters that say, Pussy Riot stands with Hong Kong. He took off the mask and gave a speech, and there was some press there, but there were very few people there. He then walked away, and I went up to him. I'd met him twice before. And my last wrong prediction, I'll tell you. In 2013, I met him for the first time, a 16-year-old kid. He had led a protest in 2012 that had successfully blocked the coming in of patriotic education to Hong Kong. It was an amazing victory. And I met him because somebody wanted me to give him advice about going to college in America. And I said, like, well, this is interesting, I'll give him the advice, I'm interested in the history of movements, and he was active in a movement. But I thought to myself, luckily I didn't write it, so I didn't go on paper. I said, he's more famous now than he'll ever be. He'll never do anything that will have him in the spotlight the way he was in 2012, when he was locally famous, not globally. And a year later, he was globally famous. And so then I met him a later time with somebody who's in the room here, too. And we talked to him, and he was in an in-between phase. And then I saw him after this event. I went up to him, and I said, Joshua, I'm Jeff Wasserstrom. We've met a couple times before. And he goes, you remember me? And I was just blown away by that because I think about him a lot. I study this kind of stuff. And I thought maybe he was joking, but he really doesn't joke much. He's a very serious young man. He only jokes with his friends. I'm not a friend like that. And then later I just wondered about it, and maybe I found it very poignant when I think about it, because what he meant, I think, was somebody out there is still paying attention to Hong Kong, because the world had largely started ignoring Hong Kong. Some very worrisome things had happened. 5 booksellers had been kidnapped, spirited across the border because they were publishing the kinds of books that you can publish in Hong Kong but not on the mainland, and the mainland did not like them doing that. And the world, this made news, but the world's been very distracted lately, as you probably noticed. It didn't make sustained news. There were other events like that were very worrying to people in Hong Kong. There were people who ran for office and got elected and then were disqualified on technicalities. And so people were just getting very frustrated. This was a building up frustration that is part of what's been happening over the summer there. But he thought at that point that it was interesting that people remembered. So then, what happened is people have started to both get more active. There have been protests that have gotten larger and larger, and the world has started paying attention more. This is a picture of the vigil, the first one that I ever went to this last June. This is a picture of the June 4th Museum. That's one of the things that can only exist, that's related to the massacre, can only exist in Hong Kong, not on the mainland. This was the last thing that I saw, public action that I saw in Hong Kong. And it was at the start of the movement that's still going on. At the vigil, at the end of the vigil, speakers said, if you care about Hong Kong's future, if you care about democracy, come out on the streets the following Sunday. We're going to have a big march against this extradition law that was seen as a threat to Hong Kong's separate rule of law. The extradition law, they felt, would blur the line between the mainland and Hong Kong in legal terms. And Hong Kong, though was never free under British colonial rule, had a very strong independent court system and rule of law. So this was the last public event that I saw in Hong Kong before flying home, and it's a silent march by 3,000 members of the legal profession. Not a group typically given to taking part in marches. It was a silent march all dressed in black. It was a kind of vigil for the rule of law in Hong Kong after the vigil for the martyrs of 1909. Then the movement began to grow. The march on June 9th was 1 million people by some estimates. June 12th, there was a clash between protesters and police, and there was claims of police brutality, and then there was an even bigger march of about 2 million people after that. And the movement has continued to roil and has continued to go. So, in ending, I want to just give you a couple of ways that we might think about where Hong Kong is now and what this story fits into. And one way is, and I'll come back to this, is 100 years. That this is kind of a last gasp in Hong Kong, perhaps, of that May 4th spirit. Maybe even a parallel to what happened 100 years ago in the mainland. The protest of the May 4th movement in 1919, I won't give you the whole history lesson, but it was essentially an anti-imperialist movement. It was pushing back against parts of China that had been under German control, being given after World War I to Japanese. It was a complaint against police roughing up protesters. It was a protest for the right to protest itself and against foreign powers having too much control in China, and against rulers in China being too beholden to foreign powers. In some ways, the protests in Hong Kong now fit all of that. It's a pushback against Beijing being seen as a foreign power, Carrie Lam being seen as too beholden to Beijing, the police treating protesters too roughly, the right to protest being under fire. So you can see this as a 100-year repetition. There's a myth of the 100-year flood, that every 100 years a river will just overflow its banks and it'll change things. And we can see the May 4th movement changed China, but it didn't succeed initially. It initially failed. Those parts of Shandong province still went to the Japanese. The Chinese government refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles, but it went into effect anyway. Hong Kong, the protests have been very inspiring to many people. It has succeeded in certain things. The extradition law has been withdrawn, but in many ways, the larger story is still going to be ever greater control and tightening. So that's one way to think of it in a 100-year cycle. But in Chinese numerology, 60-year cycles are also very important. And so thinking about what happened exactly 60 years ago can be worth doing as well. 60 years ago in 1959, Tibet had an uprising, and it was crushed, and Tibet went from being having an arguably lighter form of control to becoming one of the most tightly controlled parts of China, the PRC. And the reason why this is relevant for Hong Kong is Tibet in the early 1950s wasn't promised one country, two systems, but was promised something like that. A high degree of autonomy, a preservation of a different way of life, a light touch from Beijing, and then that disappeared 60 years ago. So I think that's a very kind of worrisome way to think about it. And it's a powerful one. And it's one that wasn't a parallel that people were thinking about much in Hong Kong. Only a few people were saying our future could be like Tibet's future. But now it's one that has become part of the story. People haven't completely given up, so I'll give you the last thing about right now. There are people who are still claiming that it's a fight worth fighting, and it may, the odds may be impossible against it, but that sometimes, eventually at least, people triumph over impossible odds. And this is the last of the analogies, and I promise it's really the last analogy. One way to think about what's happening in Hong Kong now that I find effective is that in 1979 through 81 in Eastern Europe, in Poland, there was a movement called Solidarity, which gained incredible amount of popular support, the biggest social movement of its kind in a Communist Party-run state, and it was crushed. It was crushed by Polish leaders who were part of the Soviet Empire. Moscow did not send in troops. Local forces suppressed it, just as largely what's going on in Hong Kong is being suppressed by local forces. Martial law was imposed, many people were imprisoned, and it seemed in the short run that Solidarity was a failure. 8 years later, Solidarity won its first election and took power in Poland. So that could be seen as a hopeful way to do it. The movement is crushed, but the embers stay alive and rise up again. But this is not a prediction, because for Solidarity to rise again and succeed, Moscow had to change. There had to be a figure like Mikhail Gorbachev that made it clear to different satellite states that he wasn't going to back repression of them again. So something would have to happen in Beijing, but if you think about it, what's happened in Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party has changed many times. I don't see any signs of it changing. I don't see any signs of a loosening. But as I've told you throughout, I'm a terrible predictor. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay, so if you'll indulge me for a minute to switch gears here, I want to ask Jeff a question about everyday life in Hong Kong, and I'm going to set that question up with a long preface. Partly because those of you who know me know that I have developed a peculiar interest in infrastructure. Whoever knew that infrastructure could be so interesting, and as I've studied it more and more, I've found infrastructural connections to everything. And because of that interest, people started asking me questions this summer about infrastructure in Hong Kong, and they started asking me things like, why are the protesters occupying the airport? Why are they trashing NTR stations, the mass transit railroad, the subway? Why are they trashing NTR stations? And I mean, on one level, the most obvious answer, and the answer that people give readily, is that disruption gets noticed. Just like Jeff was saying about Joshua Wong, you know, if the world's going to forget Hong Kong, we're going to make sure that that doesn't happen. And Hong Kong has one of the busiest, but also most efficient airports in the world, and this certainly did get noticed. But beyond that, there's an infrastructural dimension to the protests in Hong Kong that I think is really revealing, and I want to just talk a little bit about that because it tells us a lot about everyday life, even though and I'll see if, whether Jeff wants to add to that. When I first started going to China, Hong Kong was really an infrastructural marvel to me back in the early 80s. And there was, as you can imagine, a vast infrastructural gap between Hong Kong and mainland China at that time. It had an amazingly efficient system of rapid transit that had only just started in the late 70s, early 80s, but was already kind of a state-of-the-art system. And that system increasingly became the lifeblood of Hong Kong. The MTR keeps everyone's commute manageable. It's where people in Hong Kong spend a lot of their time. It's a landscape of stations and tubes and train cars that is probably just as familiar to people in Hong Kong as the skyline and the harbor and everything else. And it's one of the places in Hong Kong that people spend most of their time in. It makes it possible to live out in the new territories where apartments are cheaper and still work in Central and not have too terrible of a commute. The efficiency of the system has also made it possible for the protesters to move around the city like water, as they've described it. And so, of course, the system that made Hong Kong a demonstration to the world, a model of mass transit to the world and efficient infrastructure has also has really shaped the nature of protest, and the fact that protests have been able to pop up here and there very quickly, the protesters have been able to get around the city very, very rapidly. The government and the police have had a real hard time kind of keeping up with their movements because of the infrastructural system is so efficient. And for that reason, in part, the MTR has developed or has clearly become seen by the protesters firmly in the government camp. And has been, in many regards, weaponized by the government. Stations have become flashpoints of conflict, and I think there's a map of the system that I was going to put up, but stations have been flashpoints of conflict between protesters and police, and between protesters and pro-China gangs as well. But when police began launching tear gas into MTR stations, that clearly crossed a line in many people's eyes. The MTR, being the lifeblood of Hong Kong, was in many ways regarded like Hong Kong itself as apolitical, neutral, just interested in business, just getting to work, just buying and selling, just doing our job, just getting to the office on time. And for a while, it seemed like the protests were able to go on in kind of a different reality, and that the city still functioned in a way that everyone could be proud of. It still had its amazing infrastructure system. But soon that line was crossed. And a similar kind of line was crossed when tear gas started to be launched inside shopping malls. That's another kind of sacred space in Hong Kong, besides MTR stations and shopping malls, is another one. And have been similar flashpoints. So the MTR is now an overt political actor in the Hong Kong protests. And the government has manipulated the train line, tried to quell the protests, closing lines, closing stations. Protesters have responded by trashing the stations and trains and calling the MTR the Communist Party's railroad, which is kind of astonishing. But it has been an effective weapon for the government, at times turning public opinion against the protesters because there's so much disruption to people's daily commute. None of this should really have been so surprising, I suppose. MTR is majority owned by the Hong Kong government. It's also has been a champion of greater integration between Hong Kong and the mainland. And the most obvious example of that has come in the form of the development of high-speed rail, the high-speed rail connection between Hong Kong and the mainland, and it's that's the high-speed rail station that was recently completed in West Kowloon. That became a flashpoint when it was opened just a couple years ago, because part of the space within the station is part of the territorial administration of the PRC. So here in the heart of Kowloon, you have a space in which the rules and laws and police actions from within the PRC hold. And this was seen as a direct affront to the one country, two systems, the spatiality of one country, two systems, right? That right in the heart of Kowloon, you could have a space opened up that in which, for example, booksellers could be, taken into custody without due process. And the train cars themselves were also kind of regarded as that kind of space, traveling through Hong Kong. These were spaces, PRC territorial spaces within Hong Kong. And so the West Kowloon, the high-speed rail station and the line became a kind of a symbolic of the way that the efficiencies and the connectivities of infrastructure were knitting Hong Kong closer and closer to the mainland in an almost irresistible way, right? Another example is the new bridge that was recently completed between Hong Kong and Zhuhai and Macau. In an almost irresistible way, because everybody in Hong Kong loves efficient transportation, wants to be able to move around, and increasingly they want to be able to move across the border. They want to be able to move across Shenzhen and into other parts of the Pearl River Delta area, because for one reason, the cost of living in Hong Kong has gotten so prohibitive that a lot of people are living in Shenzhen just across the border and yet commuting into Hong Kong every day. Their kids are going to school in Hong Kong and yet living across the border in Shenzhen or other parts of the mainland. So this is regarded as a kind of a particularly, almost unfair, almost sinister way in which the same kinds of creeping decay of the one country, two, the basic law and one country, two systems arrangement has been felt by people in Hong Kong, and perhaps that's also a reason why infrastructure has become such a medium, such a target in many ways of the protests. So infrastructure, I started out by saying infrastructure it used to be what distinguished Hong Kong from the mainland in many ways. The basic law was supposed to maintain that distinction. And you still feel it when you cross the border. This are the last two pictures of, this is the station at the Shenzhen-Hong Kong border. Luohu station on the Hong Kong side, Luohu station on the Shenzhen side. And you still feel it when you cross the border. The signs change, the colors inside the trains change. The voice on the Hong Kong side is still got a British accent. Mind the gap. On the Shenzhen side, it has an American accent. The English part, anyway. The characters are complex characters in Hong Kong and the simplified characters in Shenzhen. So you still see some of that difference, but underneath that, the infrastructures are connecting, and that's what they want to do. That's what infrastructures do. They increasingly connect, and they're becoming increasingly politicized in that regard. So, Jeff. Everyday life, so this is one way that everyday life has become so fundamentally affected by the protests in ways that I think people didn't really expect. For a while, people felt that they could get by with their day office jobs, their weekend protest work, and the two could coexist. Do you think daily life has changed irrevocably because of what's happened this summer? We'll start with that, and then let's open it up.
Great. Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question, and more I liked the illustrations, because that is, it's part of the sort of both the dream and the nightmare of the connectivity and things. And one other thing that I think people are very intensely aware of, another form of infrastructure, is the internet. And the internet works radically differently on the mainland with blocking sites, and it works radically differently in Hong Kong. And what's interesting is Macau never gets much mention, but it's very interesting. Macau, the internet works like Hong Kong. I tested this on June 4th because I spent part of the time in a Macau casino and part of the time in Hong Kong, I wanted to see, could you go on the web in Macau and check out Tiananmen sites or the New York Times, all this, and you could, but nobody was doing that. And so another hope is that actually over time, the change will be that people will stop behaving differently. And that's the other part of that. So, but the part about daily life continuing in the movement is very interesting. During the umbrella movement, I hadn't really thought about this quite this way. Students very intensely wanted to, it was an alternative world on the streets, but they set up a study area so they could continue their studies while being on strike. So it was a way of very interestingly saying, we're on strike, but it's not because we're goofing off, it's actually just a more intense form of our education. And so, yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And I would just, I don't have an answer, but I would add some things to it. Like one of the questions is, will university life, which to a certain extent could continue, you can have a very different kind of conference in Hong Kong than you can on the main. Will that difference disappear? But I just want to give a couple of anecdotes about the infrastructural thing. And here's just another way to think about the pride that can be taken in China's rise, and including Hong Kong. In the old story of colonialism, the metropole always had better infrastructure than the colony, I assume, right? So the idea was if you went from London to any part of the colonies, if anything, you were moving back in time to a place where the pace of life was slower, things were more dangerous, things didn't work as well. One way, and places in the global south were seen as always that way. And in China, when I went to Shanghai in '86, nothing seemed to move faster than in my world in America in 1986. Nothing seemed futuristic. If anything, it seemed the past. But now when I go to Shanghai, things move faster. I don't know if somebody's more advanced thinking of that. And Hong Kong, when Hong Kong continued this development, it surpassed the Britain as it had been. And Britain is in decline that way. And I was really struck by this. One of the last things I did before going to Hong Kong was I went to Britain, and I interviewed Lord Patton, but then I was taking the train, the subway, the tube, to the airport at Heathrow, and I had swapped out my SIM card, so I didn't have internet access, and I didn't know which terminal I was getting off at Heathrow. So there was a guy who looked about my age. I hadn't talked to him, but he was playing on his smartphone, and I thought he had connectivity. So I said, I'm sorry to bother you, but could you please check on the internet to see which terminal my flight's? And we had no other interaction. And he just said, I can't access the internet here. What do you think? I'm not in Hong Kong. He was a British insurance firm that was working in Hong Kong and had just been on a trip back to England, and he was ready to return to Hong Kong where things worked better. And I thought that was just really striking, that. But the other infrastructural thing that I'll leave with is I bought a SIM card when I got to Hong Kong. One of the next trips, the next trip I took was to Hong Kong. And I asked when I was getting the SIM card, I say, I'm going to be going to Macau, will this SIM card work there too? And the person said, sure. And so I did it, and I wasn't going to the mainland, so I went to Hong Kong, and I went to Macau and checked the web and so forth. But then when I was leaving and I took the SIM card out, I had the box, the envelope that the SIM card had come in. It was called Greater Bay Area SIM card. It was actually a SIM card that worked in Hong Kong, Macau, and Zhuhai, and Shenzhen. For phone. The phone, it's seamless. You can move there. The internet is not seamless. If I had gone to the mainland, I'm sure the websites would have been blocked. But there are people who say in the future, the people promoting the Greater Bay Area sense, it's great. You won't even notice when you're crossing the border. So the question is about the internet. Will you not notice? Because in Hong Kong by then, the internet will work the same as Shenzhen. Or the earlier hope was that maybe eventually the internet will work the other way around. But that's, I think, infrastructure is a great thing to watch for that. So I'd love to get any questions, comments, criticism.
This is a great topic. So I actually grew up in southern China, right? And I grew So I feel, yeah, you're right, like southern China is really, really different from northern China. Because I went to Beijing for school after I grew up and like I experienced the difference. So my question is, I still have family members in Hong Kong and I also have family members in southern China. So I want to know like your perspective on like how these like different view of people probably, like how that might affect this process right now, like the protests and like what's the I don't know like how to say.
No, I think it's a really good question, and I'm really glad you brought that up. I was at an event at Irvine at the end of the talk. The last question was a similar one where somebody said that the panelists in that, we talked a lot about the attitude on the mainland, the attitude in Hong Kong, and he was saying, where do I fit? Because he felt in between. And I think it's really interesting. I think one of the things is we're right now, partly we have a kind of problem with language about this. When people in Hong Kong say, don't consider me Chinese, I think what they're saying is they're rejecting the definition of all or nothing Chineseness loyal to the state that the Chinese Communist Party has in mind. They're not rejecting everything about China or Chinese culture or Chinese tradition. And so in a sense, what I think going forward will be very interesting to see is if there's some effort to connect a kind of South China identity, which is, marked by things like use of Cantonese, and whether there's a degree of, when things like Cantonese gets threatened within Hong Kong, there may be sympathy for somebody like your family members say, even if they don't sympathize with the political part, they may sympathize with the cultural part. And so I think it'll just be interesting to see if there's a kind of move toward maybe saying, because another option would be say, don't think of me as CCP Chinese, think of me as South China Chinese. And there are symbols that could be accessed for that, like Sun Yat-sen as a model for a kind of a vision of China that was more cosmopolitan, open to currents from different parts of the world. But it's dividing families, it's dividing extended families within Hong Kong, it's dividing some nuclear families. In the This American Life episode that was just on the radio, they have one with a son who's a protester and father is a policeman. And just what's that like within the family? I do know of families, some of people have written about this, the poet Tammy Ho, who's writing these extraordinary poems about everything that's going on and posting them on the internet, so sort of versifying the revolution as it takes place. But she wrote in 2015 about the toll within a family that having some member, she had, I think, brothers-in-law who were policemen and other family members who were protesters, so it divides there, but then it also divides across the border. So I don't have an answer, but I think it's really important to remind people that there isn't just one, that the mainland population is far from homogeneous. There are many people who have many different feelings about the Hong Kong protests, and there are people who don't like the protests but feel that they want to be able to interpret Chineseness their own way, wherever that is, even Shanghainese who want to see a distinctive form of Shanghai version of Chineseness that's not the same as Beijing's. So thanks for making that comment. Yeah. Back there?
Yeah, hi. I have a couple of related questions about the activist effort over in Hong Kong. There's the very important work on nonviolent social change movements by Erica Chenoweth, who used to be at DU and now she's at Harvard, and Jean Sharp. And I'm wondering, have there been people who've been, trying to share that with people in Hong Kong, and then within the movement, maybe you could speak some about discussions of violence and nonviolence and property violence versus violence against people, and some of what's going on. I'm sure that it's not just, there's not a single group called the protesters, so what's going on?
No, that's great. There is a lot of discussion, and people have been bringing up Sharp in particular. So here's part of the background that's important to know. In 2014, before the movement began, there was a call for Occupy Central with Peace and Love. Benny Tai, a law professor at Hong Kong University, was one of the main instigators of that, organizers. Another was a Reverend Chu, and a third was Chan Kin Man, a sociologist at Chinese University of Hong Kong. They were all devoted nonviolent activists. They talked a lot about Gandhi and Thoreau and the inspiration they had. And there's a wonderful last lecture that Chan Kin Man gave that's on YouTube where he talks about it. He talks about the people he's looked to for inspiration in his life. Because he was about to go on trial for inciting people to incite to create a public nuisance. So those people were imprisoned, were sentenced to, were jailed and put in jail in April of this year for things that they had done years before. Other leaders who also were connected to nonviolence or not were also jailed. So one thing that happened was that taught the movement that if you have clearly designated leaders, it's easier to break the movement because they get arrested. And also in the limits of nonviolence and sort of taking some of the most powerful voices for nonviolence out of the mix beforehand, which is going to make it more likely to have violence. Another thing that happened was the focus of the nonviolence would say, well, after the umbrella movement didn't work through social movement, we'll focus on local elections. They focused on local elections, they won some of the local elections, and then because of the way they took the oaths of office, they got disqualified. And at one point, there was a case going before a Hong Kong decision of whether they should be disqualified or not, and Beijing said, we're not going to wait for you to decide, we're deciding, they're disqualified. So part of the story of the ratcheting up for violence is nonviolent things playing within the rules then don't succeed, and then some people are arguing we need to get more militant. It's a very familiar tension within the movement between different wings of this. It's a very leaderless movement now. There are people arguing for different cases. There are people who are very critical of violence. There's been a focus on violence against property. Almost all of it's been violence against property, not against people. But there's also been a feeling that the umbrella movement partly decayed by splits within the movements. There's been a strong desire, even if you disagree with things, to not abandon a whole camp of it. So there's been a say, argue with the people who are being more violent. Don't say they have nothing to do with you. So anyway, it's an ongoing thing. There is a lot, and there are things to read about. There are people.
And I mean, the reason I mentioned Chenoweth is that she actually has more of a quantitative basis where she's been able to show that nonviolent change movements in many different countries are generally twice as effective in achieving their goals. So I'm just...
And there are people who are saying, one, we need to do this. There are other people that would say, it's very interesting. One of the things I've read in one of the editorials criticizing the criticizing the youth for violence said, remember the heroes of nonviolent action, Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. Well, Nelson Mandela had a period of violence in this. It takes a long time. Now there are a lot of worrisome things. Some people are using Belfast as an analogy in long term. There are comparisons with the Palestinian situation with Israel, and apparently with Israel too, sometimes there have been jailing of moderate voices, which then help give an upper hand to more violent forces, which then justify the more violent crackdown. So yeah, it's a dynamic, and we saw it in America with Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. We've seen repetitions of this, and they're always different, but there's always a similar kind of logic and a similar kind of debate. But there are people reading some of those same people. You had a question here?
My question is, so you can answer this.
Sensitive question I might want to skip if you had trouble hearing. I can't wait. How do I think it will end?
We can
turn the camera off.
Yeah. No, no.